Welcome to the Trend Reddit channel. This is a place where we share interesting, humorous, and emotional stories about family life. A girl wandering in the dark corners of the city accidentally discovers a mysterious document belonging to a famous millionaire. But what drives her to boldly demand something unimaginable in exchange for these secrets? Join us on her journey, where poverty and wealth collide, revealing hidden facets never before uncovered. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any videos. Be sure to click the notification bell to get the latest updates on our new story episodes. Thank you for your support and for joining us on Trend Reddit. Lila Thompson, a 22-year-old woman, had spent the last few years navigating the unforgiving streets of a bustling city. Life hadn't been kind to her. She had no family to turn to, no steady job, and each day was a battle for survival. The streets were her only home, and the city, though full of opportunity for some, felt like a constant reminder of how far she was from a life of stability and comfort. The noise, the lights, and the endless streams of people served as daily companions, but none of it filled the void of isolation that she carried inside. Lila had learned to fend for herself, but the relentless struggle wore her down. Her clothes were tattered, her face often streaked with exhaustion, and the few belongings she had were stuffed into an old backpack she always carried. She was used to blending into the background, just another person fighting to stay afloat in a city that didn't seem to care whether she sank or swam. Still, despite her circumstances, there was a quiet determination within her, a spark that refused to go out. She hadn't given up on life, even if it felt like life had given up on her. One evening, as Lila wandered through a particularly crowded part of the city, something unusual caught her eye. There, lying discarded near the curb, was a sleek leather briefcase. It looked expensive, a stark contrast to the usual debris that littered the streets. Her first thought was to leave it alone. It wasn't hers, and in a city like this, it was better not to get involved in things that didn't concern her. But something about the briefcase intrigued her. Curiosity got the better of her, and before she could talk herself out of it, she bent down and picked it up. The weight of the briefcase suggested it held something valuable. She hesitated for a moment, standing under the dim glow of a street lamp, before finally opening it. Inside, to her surprise, was a thick stack of documents. They looked official: contracts, legal papers, and financial statements, all neatly organized. Her eyes scanned the papers until she saw a name printed in bold at the top of one of the contracts: Ethan Ford. The name was familiar, though Lila had never met him. Ethan Ford was one of the city's most prominent businessmen, a man known for his wealth and influence. He owned several companies and had his hands in many industries. To people like Lila, he was almost a mythical figure, someone whose life existed in a completely different universe. As she realized whose briefcase she was holding, her pulse quickened. These papers weren't just important, they were crucial to someone as powerful as Ethan Ford. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. She could try to sell the documents, there were certainly people who would pay good money for them. In fact, if she played her cards right, this could be her way out of the streets, a chance to start over. But even as the idea formed in her head, something stopped her. She couldn't bring herself to do it. Despite everything life had thrown at her, Lila still had her principles. She wasn't a thief, and she wasn't going to take advantage of someone else's misfortune, no matter how tempting the opportunity seemed. Instead, another idea began to take shape. What if she returned the briefcase to Ethan Ford? It seemed absurd at first, the idea of someone like her showing up at his mansion, offering him something he probably didn't even know was missing yet. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Maybe this was her chance. Not to ask for money, but to prove that despite her situation, she was still someone with integrity, someone worth noticing. The next morning, Lila set out for Ethan Ford's mansion. It wasn't hard to find, everyone in the city knew where it was. The grand estate sat at the edge of the wealthiest part of town, a symbol of everything she had never had. As she approached the iron gates, she could feel the weight of the decision she was about to make. Her heart raced as she thought about what lay ahead. She walked up to the entrance, her worn-out shoes padding softly on the stone path, and rang the doorbell. The mansion was even more intimidating up close, its towering walls and immaculate gardens reminding her of the vast distance between her world and his. For a moment, she wondered if she was making a mistake, if this would all end with her being turned away or worse, ridiculed for daring to step into such a place. But she had come this far, and there was no turning back now. After what felt like an eternity, the large front door creaked open, revealing a stern-looking woman in her late 50s. Her sharp eyes immediately took in Lila's disheveled appearance, and her expression hardened. This must be Helen, the housekeeper, Lila thought. Everything about her demeanor screamed authority. "Yes?" Helen asked, her tone cold and clipped. She clearly wasn't accustomed to unannounced visitors, especially not ones who looked like Lila. I'm here to see Mr. Ford," Lila stammered, clutching the briefcase tightly in her hands. "I found something that belongs to him." Helen's eyes narrowed, her suspicion evident. "Mr. Ford is a very busy man. I'm sure whatever you have can be left with me," she said, dismissively waving a hand toward the briefcase. But Lila shook her head. "It's important. I really need to give this to him directly." Helen's frown deepened, clearly annoyed by Lila's persistence. For a moment, it seemed like she was about to slam the door in Lila's face, but something in Lila's voice must have convinced her to pause. With a reluctant sigh, Helen stepped aside and motioned for Lila to enter. The inside of the mansion was even more opulent than Lila had imagined. Marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and the walls were adorned with expensive art. Lila suddenly felt very small, her presence out of place in this world of wealth and luxury. Helen led her down a long hallway before stopping outside a large, ornate door. "Wait here," she said curtly, disappearing inside to fetch Ethan Ford. After a few tense moments of waiting, the door to Ethan Ford's office swung open. Lila's heart pounded in her chest as she caught her first glimpse of the man whose life she had inadvertently stumbled into. Ethan stood by the large windows, his silhouette framed by the city skyline beyond. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried an air of authority that was both intimidating and captivating. Without turning around, he addressed Lila in a calm but firm voice. "I understand you have something that belongs to me," he said, his tone carrying no hint of warmth or curiosity. Lila swallowed hard, clutching the briefcase as if it were her lifeline. "Yes, I found this," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. She stepped forward cautiously and held out the briefcase, her hands trembling slightly as she waited for his response. Ethan turned to face her then, his sharp blue eyes studying her with an intensity that made Lila feel exposed, as though he could see right through her. His gaze drifted from her worn-out clothes to the briefcase in her hands, and for a brief moment, he seemed to weigh the situation before walking over to her. He took the briefcase without a word, inspecting it briefly before looking up at her again. "Where did you find this?" His question was straightforward, but there was an undercurrent of suspicion in his voice, as if he expected some hidden motive behind her actions. Lila took a deep breath, determined not to let her nerves get the better of her. "I found it on the street. It was just lying there. I recognized your name on the documents, so I thought I should return it." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he didn't quite believe her. "You could have kept it," he said, his voice calm but probing. "There's a lot of valuable information in these papers. You could have sold them, or tried to blackmail me. But instead, you're here." Lila shook her head. "I didn't want to do that. I just thought it was the right thing to return it to you." Ethan seemed to consider her words, his expression unreadable. He opened the briefcase and quickly skimmed through the documents inside. As he did, Lila stood there, feeling like an intruder in a world she didn't belong in. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint rustle of papers as Ethan flipped through them. Finally, he closed the briefcase and looked up at her again, his expression softening ever so slightly. "These documents are important," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "You did the right thing bringing them back." Relief washed over Lila, but it was short-lived. Ethan's demeanor shifted again, this time to one of wariness. "But I can't help wondering why," he continued. "Why would someone like you, who could use the money, Do something like this out of the goodness of your heart. What's in it for you? Lila hadn't expected the question, and for a moment, she was at a loss for words. She had known this wouldn't be easy, but now that she was face to face with Ethan, she realized how difficult it would be to make him understand her true intentions. I don't want money, she said finally, her voice firm. I'm not here to ask for a reward. Ethan raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. No? Then what do you want? Lila hesitated, the words she had rehearsed in her head suddenly feeling strange and out of place. But she had come this far, and she couldn't back down now. I don't want anything from you, not money or anything else, she said, her voice steady despite the anxiety twisting in her stomach. All I want is to experience what it's like to be part of a family, even if it's just for a short time. The room seemed to grow quieter in the wake of her words. Ethan blinked, clearly taken aback by her request. He studied her face, searching for some clue as to whether she was serious or not. Lila could feel his gaze burning into her, but she stood her ground, meeting his eyes with as much resolve as she could muster. You want to be part of my family? Ethan asked slowly, as if the idea were so foreign to him that he needed time to process it. Lila nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. Just for a week, she clarified. I've never had a family of my own, and I just want to know what it feels like. That's all I'm asking. Ethan didn't respond right away. He continued to watch her, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, Lila feared he might laugh in her face or worse, tell her to leave and never come back. But instead, he simply stood there, his eyes locked on hers, as if trying to decide what kind of person she really was. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, thoughtful. That's an unusual request, he said, almost to himself. Most people in your situation would have asked for money, or at least something material in return for what you've done. Lila shrugged slightly, not knowing what else to say. I'm not most people. Ethan smiled faintly at that, though the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He seemed to be weighing her words, considering the implications of what she was asking. After what felt like an eternity, he finally nodded, as if coming to a decision. All right, he said, his voice firm. You can stay. For 1 week. But after that, we go our separate ways. Understood? Lila's heart leaped with both relief and apprehension. She nodded quickly. Understood. Ethan turned away then, signaling the end of the conversation. Helen will show you to a guest room, he said over his shoulder, before disappearing into the depths of the mansion. As Lila followed Helen down the grand hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just taken a turn she could never have predicted. Ethan sat behind his desk, the glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the room. He hadn't said much after Lila made her unusual request, but now that she was standing in front of him again, he looked at her with renewed curiosity. His fingers drummed lightly on the surface of his desk, a sign of his restless thoughts. What you're asking for, it's unusual, he said finally, breaking the silence. No one's ever made a request like that before. Lila stood quietly, her hands folded in front of her, trying to keep her nerves under control. She had known from the start that what she was asking for was strange, but she hadn't expected Ethan's reaction to be so measured, so calm. She had prepared herself for laughter, for dismissal, even for outright rejection. But not this. I know it sounds strange, Lila said, her voice soft but steady. But it's all I've ever wanted, to know what it's like to be part of a family, even if it's just for a little while. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. You've never had a family, he asked, not with pity, but with genuine curiosity. Lila shook her head. Not really. I grew up in foster homes, bouncing from place to place. I was never anywhere long enough to feel like I belonged. She paused, her gaze dropping to the floor for a moment. And since I've been on my own, it's been even harder. I don't know what it's like to have people who care about you, who are there for you no matter what. Ethan considered her words carefully, his face unreadable. He was a man who had spent his life making calculated decisions, and Lila could see that he was weighing her request with the same level of scrutiny he applied to his business dealings. It wasn't an easy decision for him, and she understood why. "Why me?" Ethan asked, leaning forward slightly. "Of all the people you could have asked, why come to me?" Lila bit her lip, choosing her words carefully. "I didn't plan it," she admitted. "When I found the briefcase, I didn't know what I was going to do. But when I realized it belonged to you, I saw it as a chance to ask for something I've never had before. You're someone who seems like you have everything together. You have a family, a life that's stable and secure. I guess I thought if anyone could give me a glimpse of what that feels like, it would be you." Ethan was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. He seemed to be wrestling with something internally, though Lila couldn't tell what. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer than before. "You know, people often assume that because I'm successful, because I have money, that my life is perfect," he said. "But they don't see the sacrifices, the struggles. Family can be complicated." Lila nodded, understanding that Ethan's life wasn't as simple as it appeared from the outside. She had no illusions about perfection. All she wanted was a taste of what it felt like to belong somewhere, even if it was just for a short while. "I'm not asking for perfect," Lila said quietly. "I just want to feel like I'm part of something, just for a week. After that, I'll be gone, and you'll never have to see me again." Ethan's gaze softened at her words. He could see the vulnerability in her, the raw honesty in her request. There was no hidden agenda, no ulterior motive. She wasn't trying to manipulate him, and that struck a chord with him in a way he hadn't expected. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" Ethan asked, his tone gentler now. Lila nodded, her eyes meeting his. "Yes. I wouldn't have come here if I wasn't." Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face as if trying to make sense of the situation. "You're asking me to let a stranger into my home, to treat you like family. That's a lot to ask, especially for someone in my position." "I know," Lila replied quickly. "And I know it's not easy. But I promise I won't cause any trouble. I'll just be here, quietly, trying to experience something I've never had." Ethan sat in silence again, weighing his options. He was a man used to taking risks, but this was different. This wasn't a business deal, it was personal. Yet something about Lila's request tugged at him. Maybe it was the honesty in her eyes, or the fact that she wasn't asking for anything material, but something far more meaningful. If you find it interesting, please like it. If not, please comment number 1. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this video. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ethan leaned forward, clasping his hands together on the desk. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "I'll let you stay here for a week, as you asked. But there are conditions." Lila's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't been sure if he would agree, but now that he had, she felt both relief and a surge of anxiety. "Of course," she said quickly. "Anything. You'll stay here as a guest," Ethan continued. "I'll treat you like part of the family, as you've asked. But at the end of the week, you leave. No strings, no lingering attachments. Understood?" Lila nodded, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. "Understood. And one more thing," Ethan added, his gaze steady. "You'll need to earn the trust of the people in this house. That won't be easy. You'll be treated fairly, but there will be expectations." Lila nodded again, her throat tight with emotion. "I understand." Ethan stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. "Helen will show you to your room. We'll start tomorrow." Lila felt a rush of relief, mixed with nervous anticipation. She had gotten what she asked for, but now came the hardest part, living up to her end of the deal. As she followed Helen down the long hallway, she couldn't help but wonder what the next week would hold, and whether this strange arrangement would truly give her the sense of belonging she so desperately craved. Lila's first morning at the mansion dawned quietly, but the atmosphere inside the grand house was anything but calm. As she navigated her way through the hallways, the sheer opulence of the place felt overwhelming. The crystal chandeliers, the marble floors, the perfectly arranged artwork, all of it screamed luxury, and yet, she felt completely out of place. She had spent most of her life blending into the background, but here, everything about her seemed to stick out like a sore thumb. Helen, the housekeeper, had been less than welcoming since Lila's arrival. Her eyes were always sharp, watching Lila's every move with a kind of suspicion that was hard to miss. Helen clearly didn't trust her, and Lila could feel it in every interaction they had. This morning was no different. Helen entered the kitchen, where Lila had been nervously sipping her coffee. "I see you're already making yourself comfortable," she said, her tone polite but laced with a chill. She began to clean the already immaculate countertop, her eyes darting toward Lila every few seconds. Lila offered a small smile, hoping to ease the tension. "Just trying to stay out of everyone's way." Helen didn't return the smile. "You should," she replied coolly, as she straightened a vase on the counter. "Mr. Ford is a generous man, but that doesn't mean you've earned your place here. Don't forget that." Lila nodded, her smile fading. She had expected some resistance, but Helen's hostility felt particularly sharp. Lila wasn't here to cause trouble, but it seemed as though her very presence was enough to unsettle the housekeeper. Later that morning, Lila met Ethan's wife, Monica. Their introduction was awkward, to say the least. Monica was beautiful and poised, with an air of grace that Lila could only admire from a distance. But beneath that polished exterior was a coldness that was immediately apparent. Monica's greeting had been short and formal, and throughout their brief conversation, her discomfort was palpable. She barely looked Lila in the eye and kept her distance, as if Lila were something she didn't want to get too close to. The tension in the house grew with each passing day. Monica and Helen made no effort to hide their distrust. Conversations were clipped, polite at best, and there were no real attempts to get to know Lila. She was treated as an outsider, a temporary inconvenience. Lila did her best to be as unobtrusive as possible, but it wasn't easy. The mansion, though grand and beautiful, felt cold and unwelcoming. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed to soften toward Lila as the days went on. Their conversations were brief, but there was a warmth in his tone that had been absent during their first meeting. He asked about her life, her experiences, and listened intently as she shared bits and pieces of her past. It was clear that Ethan was trying to understand her, to get a sense of who she really was beneath the surface. His curiosity seemed genuine, and Lila found herself looking forward to their talks. Despite Ethan's growing acceptance, the strain between Lila and the rest of the household persisted. Helen continued to watch her closely, almost as if she were waiting for Lila to slip up, to reveal some ulterior motive that would confirm her suspicions. And Monica, though outwardly polite, kept her distance, barely engaging with Lila unless it was absolutely necessary. One afternoon, while Lila was sitting in the library, flipping through a book she had picked off one of the shelves, she overheard a conversation between Monica and Helen. Their voices were hushed, but the tension in their words was unmistakable. "I don't know why Ethan agreed to this," Monica was saying. "She doesn't belong here, Helen. It's only a matter of time before she starts asking for something more." Helen's reply was sharp. "I've had my eye on her since the moment she walked in. She may seem innocent, but I know better. People like her always have an agenda." Lila's stomach twisted at the words. She had known from the beginning that she wouldn't be welcomed with open arms, but hearing them talk about her like that, like she was some kind of con artist, hurt more than she expected. She had no intentions beyond what she had already asked for. All she wanted was to experience a semblance of family life, even if just for a short time. That evening, Ethan found her in the garden. She had taken to spending time there to escape the constant tension inside the house. The garden was peaceful, a sanctuary of sorts, with its blooming flowers and carefully manicured hedges. As Lila sat on one of the stone benches, staring up at the sky, Ethan approached quietly and sat down beside her. "How are you settling in?" he asked, his tone kind. Lila hesitated before answering. "It's different. I appreciate being here, I really do. But it's clear I don't exactly fit in." Ethan gave her a small, understanding smile. "They're not used to strangers. This arrangement is unusual for everyone. I know, Lila replied softly. But I don't want to cause any trouble. You're not causing trouble, Ethan assured her. But I think it's important that you understand that trust takes time. Monica and Helen, they're protective. They've been with me a long time, and they're just looking out for me, in their own way. Lila nodded, though the weight of being constantly watched and judged felt heavy. I understand that. I just wish things didn't feel so tense. Ethan was silent for a moment, as if considering his next words carefully. Give it time, he said finally. This isn't easy for anyone. But I believe in second chances, and I believe you're here for the right reasons. Lila looked up at him, surprised by his words. She had expected Ethan to be guarded, to keep her at arm's length like everyone else. But here he was, offering her a chance, a real chance, to prove herself. I won't let you down, she promised, her voice steady. Ethan gave her a reassuring nod before standing. I know you won't. With that, he left her to the quiet of the garden. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lila sat there, reflecting on everything that had happened so far. The week wasn't over yet, and there was still a long way to go, but for the first time since arriving at the mansion, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to belong here, if only for a little while. As the days passed, Lila settled into a routine, though the tension in the mansion remained thick. Monica and Helen continued to regard her with suspicion, while Ethan, to her surprise, seemed to grow more comfortable with her presence. Their conversations had become more frequent, and Lila found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't expected. Still, the undercurrent of distrust from the others kept her on edge. No matter how hard she tried to stay out of the way, she could feel the weight of their judgment in every glance and every hushed conversation that stopped the moment she entered a room. One afternoon, Ethan had taken Lila out into the city to run some errands. It was the first time they had ventured out together, and the change of scenery was a welcome break from the mansion's stifling atmosphere. As they wandered through the bustling streets, Lila found herself appreciating the anonymity that the city crowds provided. It felt strange to be out with Ethan, almost like a father and daughter, but the thought was bittersweet. She knew this arrangement was temporary, and soon she would have to return to the life she had known before. While walking through a market square, Lila spotted someone familiar out of the corner of her eye. She stopped abruptly, her breath catching in her throat. It was Daniel, an old acquaintance from her time on the streets. She hadn't seen him in years, and the sight of him brought back a flood of memories, some good, some bad. She debated whether or not to approach him, but before she could make a decision, Daniel noticed her. Lila, he called, his voice filled with surprise as he weaved through the crowd toward her. Lila smiled weakly, uncertain of how this reunion would go. Hey, Daniel. It's been a while. That's an understatement, he said with a grin, looking her up and down. You're looking different. What's the story? Lila glanced at Ethan, who was standing a few paces away, his attention momentarily distracted by something else. It's a long story, she replied, trying to keep the conversation vague. What about you? How are things? Daniel shrugged. Same old. You know how it is. There was an awkward pause before Daniel leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Listen, I saw something the other night. You're staying at Ethan Ford's place, right? Lila's stomach twisted at the mention of Ethan's name. How do you know that? Daniel's eyes darted around as if making sure no one was listening. I was out late a few nights ago, and I saw his wife, Monica, right, doing something strange. She was in this part of town, late at night, and she threw away a bunch of stuff in a dumpster. Seemed kind of shady, if you ask me. Lila's mind raced as she processed what Daniel was saying. Are you sure it was her? Positive, Daniel replied. I recognized her right away. I didn't think much of it at the time, but then I saw you with Ford just now, and I figured I should mention it. Lila's thoughts spun wildly. Could Monica have had something to do with the documents going missing? The idea seemed far-fetched, but the more she thought about it, the more it gnawed at her. Monica had been distant and cold from the moment they met, and now this strange behavior Daniel had witnessed. It didn't sit right. "Thanks for telling me, Daniel," Lila said, trying to keep her tone casual even as her heart raced. Daniel gave her a quick nod before melting back into the crowd, leaving Lila alone with her thoughts. She turned back to Ethan, who was now looking at her curiously. "Everything okay?" he asked. Lila forced a smile. "Yeah, just ran into an old friend." As they made their way back to the mansion, Lila couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was terribly wrong. She replayed Daniel's words in her mind, wondering if Monica's late-night activity had anything to do with the missing documents. If Monica had something to hide, it would explain her coldness toward Lila and her general unease about the entire situation. But why would she do it? What could she possibly gain from sabotaging Ethan? That evening, after a quiet dinner where the tension between Monica and Lila was more palpable than ever, Lila found herself pacing in her room, unable to sleep. She knew she had to tell Ethan about what Daniel had seen, but the thought of confronting him with such serious suspicions made her stomach churn. Ethan had been kind to her, and the last thing she wanted was to cause more trouble in the already strained household. But she couldn't keep this to herself. If Monica had played a role in the disappearance of those documents, Ethan deserved to know the truth. The next morning, Lila waited until she had a moment alone with Ethan in his office. Her nerves buzzed with anxiety as she sat down across from him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "Ethan, I need to talk to you about something," she began, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan looked up from his desk, his expression immediately concerned. "What is it?" Lila took a deep breath and began to explain what Daniel had told her. She watched Ethan's face closely as she spoke, searching for any sign of disbelief or anger, but his expression remained unreadable. When she finished, there was a long silence. Ethan's gaze dropped to the floor, and he seemed to be lost in thought. "Monica," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think Monica had something to do with the documents going missing?" Lila hesitated. "I don't know for sure, but it's possible. Daniel saw her late at night, getting rid of things. It just seemed strange." Ethan stood up abruptly, his hands resting on the back of his chair as he stared out the window. His face was tense, a mixture of anger and confusion playing across his features. "Why would she do that?" he muttered, almost to himself. "Why would Monica do something like that?" Lila remained silent, not wanting to push him any further. She could see the conflict in Ethan's eyes, the struggle between loyalty to his wife and the possibility that she had betrayed him. Finally, Ethan turned back to her, his expression hardened with resolve. "I'll get to the bottom of this," he said firmly. "If Monica is involved, I need to know the truth." Lila nodded, relieved that Ethan was willing to investigate but also dreading what might come next. If Monica was behind the disappearance of the documents, the fallout could be devastating for Ethan and for everyone in the house. The tension in the house had reached an unbearable level. Ethan, now filled with suspicion, had hired a private investigator to look into the situation surrounding the missing documents and Monica's odd behavior. Lila felt a mixture of guilt and anxiety, wondering if she had overstepped by sharing Daniel's information. But she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong, and Ethan had deserved to know. The investigator worked quietly, gathering information without raising suspicion in the household. Days passed with little communication, and during that time, the atmosphere between Monica and Ethan became increasingly strained. The once distant, polite exchanges between husband and wife had turned into cold silences. Monica's demeanor remained aloof, but Lila noticed the subtle signs of tension: Monica's clenched jaw, the way she avoided making eye contact with Ethan, and her nervous glances whenever she thought no one was watching. One afternoon, the investigator returned with his findings. Ethan called Lila into his office, his face grim. The investigator stood to the side, a thick file in his hands. "We found something," Ethan said, his voice heavy with the weight of the discovery. "You were right to bring this to my attention." Lila's heart pounded in her chest as she sat down, unsure of what to expect. She glanced at the investigator, who nodded silently before handing the file to Ethan. Ethan flipped it open, skimming through the pages with an unreadable expression. The documents were deliberately destroyed, Ethan said, his voice steady but cold. Monica took them and discarded them in a location far from the mansion. She knew exactly what she was doing. Lila felt a chill run down her spine. She had suspected that Monica might be involved, but hearing Ethan confirm it sent a wave of shock through her. Why, she whispered, unable to comprehend why Monica would do something so destructive. Ethan closed the file and placed it on the desk in front of him. His hands rested on top of the papers, as if trying to ground himself in the face of this betrayal. The investigator found out that Monica has been resentful for a long time. She felt like I neglected her in favor of my work. Apparently, she wanted to sabotage me, ruin something important to me to get back at me for ignoring her. Lila sat in stunned silence. She had known there was tension between Ethan and Monica, but she had never imagined it ran so deep. The thought of Monica deliberately trying to hurt Ethan, to destroy something as significant as those documents, was difficult to wrap her mind around. It was as though the elegant, composed woman she had seen every day was suddenly a stranger. Ethan's expression darkened. She admitted to the investigator that she felt trapped in this marriage, that she wanted to lash out. Destroying the documents was her way of getting back at me, hurting me where she knew it would matter. Lila swallowed hard, her mind racing. "What will you do?" she asked quietly, unsure of how Ethan would react to such a personal betrayal. Ethan stood up, his gaze shifting to the window. He stared out at the garden, his shoulders tense. "I don't know," he said after a long pause. "But I can't stay in a marriage where there's no trust. This wasn't just a mistake. This was deliberate. She tried to ruin me." The gravity of his words hung in the air. Lila felt a deep sadness for Ethan, who had clearly cared for Monica despite their difficulties. She had seen glimpses of his vulnerability in their conversations, but now, that vulnerability was laid bare. He had been betrayed by the person closest to him, and there was no easy way to fix that. "I'm sorry," Lila said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She meant it, too. Despite everything, she hadn't wanted to see Ethan hurt like this. Ethan turned to her, his expression hard but not unkind. "You don't need to apologize. You did the right thing by telling me." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "If you hadn't said anything, I might have never found out." Lila nodded, though she still felt conflicted. She had exposed the truth, but it had come at a cost. Ethan's marriage was crumbling before her eyes, and while she had done what she thought was right, the pain it caused was undeniable. The door to the office opened then, and Monica stepped inside. Her face was pale, and there was an air of resignation about her. She had likely been told by the investigator that her actions were uncovered, and now, she stood before Ethan, knowing that there was no way to hide the truth any longer. Ethan's gaze hardened as he looked at her. "You've already spoken with the investigator, so you know what he found." Monica's eyes flicked to Lila, her expression a mixture of anger and regret. "I didn't think it would come to this," she said quietly, her voice devoid of the usual coldness. I thought it would just be something between us. I didn't mean for it to get this far." Ethan's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "This was never just about us, Monica. You deliberately sabotaged me. You wanted to hurt me, and you didn't care about the consequences." Monica closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I was angry, Ethan. I felt like you didn't care anymore. Like I was invisible to you." Ethan shook his head, his voice filled with frustration. "So this was your solution? To destroy something important to me? To throw away years of trust and partnership for revenge?" Monica didn't respond, and the silence between them was deafening. Lila stood frozen, unsure if she should leave the room, but unable to tear herself away from the scene unfolding before her. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan spoke again, his voice flat. "I can't do this anymore, Monica. I can't be with someone who would do something like this." Monica's breath hitched, and for the first time, Lila saw genuine fear in her eyes. "Ethan, please. "It's over," he said firmly, cutting her off. "I want you to leave." The finality of his words hit like a punch to the gut. Monica stood there, stunned, before nodding slowly. She turned and left the office without another word, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Ethan remained standing, his gaze fixed on the door where his wife had just exited. The weight of the decision he had made pressed heavily on him, but there was no going back. The betrayal had cut too deep. Lila stayed silent, unsure of what to say. She could feel the raw emotion in the room, and for the first time since she had come to the mansion, she felt like she truly understood Ethan's pain. He sat back down at his desk, his face drawn with exhaustion. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said quietly. "It's okay," Lila replied gently. "I'm just sorry this happened." Ethan nodded but said nothing more. The truth had been revealed, and now, all that was left was the aftermath. The house felt different after Monica's departure. The tension that had once filled every corner of the mansion had lifted, but it was replaced by a quiet sense of loss. Lila couldn't help but feel the weight of it, even though Monica's actions had been the cause of so much hurt. Ethan, however, seemed determined to move forward, though it was clear the situation had taken a toll on him. For the first few days after Monica left, Ethan kept mostly to himself. He buried himself in work, spending long hours in his office, leaving little time for conversation. Lila, feeling like an intruder in the aftermath of such a personal upheaval, tried to stay out of his way. She continued her routine in the mansion but kept a low profile, unsure of where things stood between her and Ethan now that Monica was gone. One afternoon, Ethan found Lila in the garden. She was sitting on a stone bench, watching the leaves flutter in the breeze, lost in her thoughts. It had been almost a week since Monica left, and the mansion had taken on a strangely peaceful atmosphere in her absence. Ethan approached quietly, his footsteps barely making a sound on the gravel path. When Lila looked up, she saw a different expression on his face, one of quiet resolve, but also a trace of sadness. He sat down beside her without saying a word, the two of them sitting in companionable silence for a few moments, watching the garden. "I've been thinking," Ethan said finally, his voice calm but reflective. "About everything that's happened. About you." Lila turned to face him, surprised by his words. She had expected Ethan to remain distant, at least for a while longer. "What about me?" she asked carefully. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair as he gathered his thoughts. "You've been through a lot," he said. "And you've been honest with me from the start. You didn't have to return those documents. You didn't have to tell me about Monica. But you did, and I've been thinking about what that means." Lila felt her chest tighten. She had been prepared for Ethan to thank her and send her on her way once everything was settled, but now, hearing him speak like this, she wasn't sure what to expect. "You've been here for a short time," Ethan continued, "but in that time, you've shown me something I didn't expect: honesty, integrity. You've made me realize that there's more to people than what you see on the surface." Lila shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. "I just did what I thought was right," she said softly. "That's all." Ethan turned to her, his expression serious but kind. "And that's exactly why I think you deserve more than just being thanked and sent back to the life you had before." He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. "I want to help you, Lila. Not just because you helped me, but because I believe you deserve a real chance to build the life you've always wanted." Lila's breath caught in her throat. She had never expected anything more from Ethan than the week he had promised her, and now, hearing him offer her something more, something lasting, was almost too much to take in. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I want to support you. I want to help you get back on your feet, not just for a week, but for as long as it takes for you to pursue your dreams. You mentioned before that you never had a family, never had the chance to feel like you belonged anywhere. Well, I want you to feel like you belong here, for as long as you want to stay." Lila blinked, struggling to comprehend what he was offering. For the first time in her life, someone was giving her the opportunity to have a stable, secure future. It wasn't just about the mansion or the wealth, it was about having someone who believed in her, who saw her worth and wanted to invest in her future. "But why?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why would you do this for me?" Ethan looked at her with sincerity in his eyes. "Because I believe in giving people second chances. And because I've come to see you as more than just someone who stumbled into my life. You've been honest with me when others weren't. You've shown me what it means to trust someone again. And I want to give you that same trust in return." Lila felt a lump form in her throat as emotions swirled inside her. She had spent so much of her life feeling alone, like an outsider in the world, and now Ethan was offering her something she had never even dared to hope for: belonging. "You don't have to decide right now," Ethan said gently, sensing her hesitation. "But I want you to know that the offer stands. If you want to stay here, if you want to make this place your home, I would welcome it." Lila looked down at her hands, her mind racing. It felt too good to be true, this chance at a new life, a fresh start. She had been so used to fending for herself, to surviving on her own, that the idea of accepting help, of becoming part of someone else's world, felt foreign and overwhelming. But at the same time, a small part of her longed for it. She had spent so long on the outside looking in, and now, for the first time, someone was opening the door and inviting her in. It was a chance to break free from the cycle of loneliness and struggle, a chance to build something real. Finally, Lila lifted her gaze to meet Ethan's. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice filled with emotion. "I never expected. I never thought someone would do this for me." Ethan smiled, a warm and genuine smile that put her at ease. "You don't have to say anything right now. Just think about it. I'm not asking for anything in return, Lila. I just want you to know that you have a place here, if you want it." Lila nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over her. She knew she had a decision to make, one that would change the course of her life. But for the first time and as long as she could remember, she felt hope. Real, tangible hope. As they sat there in the quiet garden, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, Lila allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't revolve around survival, but around growth, security, and belonging. It was a new beginning, one she hadn't asked for, but one she realized she desperately wanted. And for the first time in a long time, Lila smiled, feeling the warmth of that hope settle deep in her chest. Thank you for listening. See you in the next episode. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Goodbye.